Greetings, everyone. Shalom. In this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about the mission of this church. Although I've discussed it a bit in previous videos, I want to go into a little more detail and also why I believe that the world needs Yeshua and his message more than ever right now. I grew up in a very fundamentalist, conservative Southern Baptist church in rural Georgia, where I'm from. And while the fellowship there was quite lovely, and there was a lot of well-meaning, good-hearted folks in that community, it was extremely dogmatic and closed-minded and based primarily upon Paul's teachings and not upon the teachings of Yeshua. And so I grew up in a very fear-based climate. There was a lot of hellfire and brimstone sermons on Sundays. I went 3 times a week, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday evening. And we had a wonderful potluck every Wednesday evening where everybody would bring a different dish to share. And it was really wonderful. Like I said, the fellowship was great. The community was nice and supportive and all of that. Although if you decided to leave the church, it wasn't quite as supportive afterwards, I noticed. And at any rate, so I never bought into that theology, even from an early age. I can remember being 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, sitting in the pew thinking, this is nonsense. Why does God require blood sacrifices for forgiveness? It doesn't make any sense. I knew even then that it didn't make any sense. And here I was surrounded by, people in their 40s, 50s, 60s that ate it up and bought into it and thought it was the truth. And they really thought Paul was onto something there with his blood atonement doctrine and his emphasis on belief rather than works and all of that. And as I've come to find out in the last 5 years or so, he also thought it was okay to eat meat sacrificed to other gods and all of that, and that he believed that it wasn't really important to follow the law as part of our spiritual path, as part of our salvation, so to say, and all of that. And so, unfortunately, I believed that was Christianity, you know, and I left the religion altogether, really, in my late teens, and I read very widely about Buddhism, Taoism, and yoga philosophy, and became heavily involved in yoga, the yoga path, and yoga philosophy into my 20s, and started attending a lot of meditation retreats and became an ordained minister in an organization that was primarily concerned with Kriya Yoga, although there's some Christian mysticism involved in the Kriya Yoga tradition and all of that. If y'all have read Autobiography of Yogi, if you know anything about Paramahansa Yogananda, you know he was a big fan of Jesus and all that. But anyway, I became an ordained minister in 2012 and served in that organization for about 8 years and left the organization about 5 years ago for a variety of reasons. And I've been on my own doing my own ministry ever since, uh, primarily, again, centered around meditation and yoga philosophy and all that. But in the last few years, I've really, although I've always considered myself a Christian mystic. I read the Gospel of Thomas when I was in my early 20s and resonated with it and really understood that to be the message of Yeshua. The true highest message of Yeshua, I think, is found in the Gospel of Thomas. And so I have always been on the sort of fringes of Christian mysticism all along, since my early 20s, really. I'm 46 now. But in the last few years, I started reading heavily about the Ebionites and the Nazarenes and Christian vegetarianism and early Christianity and the Essenes, although I'd already read widely about the Essenes before, but the main discovery that really shifted everything for me was reading two of Keith Akers' books, The Lost Religion of Jesus and Disciples, and learning more about the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, the early Christian movement, the early Jerusalem church, headed by James, Yeshua's brother, and all of these things that I talk about, excuse me, on the channel. And so a couple of years ago, I decided to start this online ministry and the YouTube channel and all of that. So we're going to be doing Sabbath services. We just had our first one. The first Saturday of each month at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So y'all are welcome to participate in those Sabbath services if you resonate with this ministry. In this church, I do not emphasize the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, very much. And that's because I think it is so highly corrupted, and most of it is not divinely inspired. Okay? There are portions of it that I enjoy, parts of Genesis, some of the prophets, parts of Psalms and Proverbs and things like that, but I don't think that most of it was divinely inspired. I think most of it was written by the P source, so-called, and probably after the Babylonian exile, the priestly caste, I think, wrote most of the Torah, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, and corrupted a lot of what we find even in the books of the prophets and stuff like that. So I think it's highly redacted and edited and altered by the priestly caste, who was primarily concerned with money flow in the temple, keeping the animal sacrifice slaughterhouse going at all costs, and sort of keeping their control over the religion and the Jewish temple and all of that. So I do not emphasize the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible very much in this ministry. Okay. Likewise, I think the New Testament is highly corrupted. We know this. And so again, I don't emphasize the New Testament all that much either, to tell you the truth. Okay. There's bits and pieces of it that I really enjoy. Most of the red letters of Yeshua and the canonical Gospels, I think, are fairly reliable, and I tend to agree with the Jesus Seminar and their assessments of the red letters of Yeshua as far as what he is most likely to have said, and those passages which we most likely cannot attribute it to the historical Jesus. So I agree with them for the most part. I think probably 75% of what's in the red letters in the New Testament are reliable and are things that Yeshua actually said and taught and preached. So you have to be very discerning when you read the Bible, the canonical Bible. But I do believe that the so-called Q source that was used by Matthew and Luke is the most reliable as far as Yeshua's teachings that we find in the canonical Bible. And so I do emphasize the Q source, and I emphasize the Gospel of Thomas. Again, the Gospel of Thomas, I'm sure people changed it over the years. And Q also, you can see that Matthew and Luke treated it differently and changed parts of it, redacted it. So it's really hard to say, y'all. But I do think that the Q source and the Gospel of Thomas are the most reliable sources that we have of Yeshua's teachings. Okay? Also, the Hebrew Gospel, the Gospel of the Hebrews. All right? We don't have much of it left, just 40 or 50 verses preserved by the early church fathers. But I do think that some of those verses accurately represent what the historical Jesus taught. Okay, so we have Q, we have the Hebrew Gospel, we have the Gospel of Thomas. I think those are all reliable early sources, first century sources. And so that is the most accurate representation that we have of Yeshua's teachings. All right, so I do not emphasize the canonical Bible very much. So if you think that for whatever reason that the Bible is the inerrant, infallible word of God, this ministry is definitely not for you. All right. I also enjoy the Epistle of James because I do believe that it was written by a scribe that was associated with Yeshua's brother James, and it accurately represents the way. And likewise, the Didache, I believe, was probably written by some of the disciples of Yeshua. I believe that. Okay. And it is an accurate representation also of the way, although there were some later interpolations that aren't so accurate. So you have to read all these texts with discernment, of course. And then later on, the Clementine Recognitions and Homilies that most scholars attribute to the Ebionites, I believe, is a very accurate representation of the way of Yeshua and is an accurate interpretation of his teachings given by Peter, Yeshua's disciple. And I believe that the Recognitions and Homilies, especially the Homilies, because it was not edited by Rufinus, preserves the Kerygmata Petru, or the preaching of Peter from the first century, along with some concepts from the book of Elkai and the Ascents of James. We also find in the Recognitions, which is also first century Jewish Christian text. So all these texts I'm mentioning are considered Jewish Christian texts. I don't resonate much with that term, Jewish Christian. I prefer Essene Ebionite, which is why I named this church the Essene Ebionite Church of Christian Mysticism. Okay. I'm a Christian mystic, so first and foremost, I emphasize mysticism. Mysticism means direct experience of the divine, knowledge and experience of the divine that we gain through our mystical practices, through contemplative prayer. All right, so I heavily emphasize the need for daily contemplative prayer. All right. And, I sort of, over the last few years, have moved away from some of the Eastern traditions for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, I do not believe they emphasize ethics and morality enough. And so I find that the ethics and morality of Yeshua are much needed. I also think the Ten Commandments were, for the most part, divinely inspired. I think Moses was a prophet of God, a true messenger. Okay, not on the level of Yeshua. Okay, but I do think that we should follow the Ten Commandments to the best of our ability. I do believe that is God's law, the law that He ordained for us to follow, along with all the teachings of Yeshua. All right. And so I emphasize Q, Gospel of Thomas, the Hebrew Gospel, the Epistle of James, the Didache, and the Recognitions and Homilies. Those are the primary texts that I teach from. There are some other texts that people in this Neo-Essene or Neo-Nazarene movement really enjoy, like the Essene Gospel of Peace, the Gospel of the Holy 12, and a couple other texts that are highly contested. And if you resonate with those texts, keep reading them, continue to find inspiration from them, by all means, right? I do not use those texts as part of my ministry as much as I enjoy them. But yeah, I don't teach out of those texts. But if you find inspiration from them, by all means, continue to read them. Continue to read any text you find inspiration from. I still like to read the Bhagavad Gita, for example, or the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. are some of the Upanishads, and from the Taoist tradition, the Zhuangzi, the Tao Te Ching. Um, so yeah, feel free to, I mean, I'm not dogmatic at all. I'm totally open. So you do you. But I'm just telling you what I do here as part of my ministry. And some people have asked me, why don't you use the term Nazarene in the title of your church? I guess I could, because I think the Nazarenes and Ebionites were essentially the same group, but it's just too long of a title. And because most scholars attribute the authorship of the Recognitions and Homilies to the Ebionites, and most scholars attribute Christian vegetarianism to the Ebionites, I don't know. I tend to use that term more than Nazarene, but there's nothing wrong with Nazarene. I mean, Yeshua was called Yeshua the Nazarene, of course. So he came from this Nazarene sect of Essenes, and he was a leader within that sect. And so not everyone, not all of the Nazarenes followed Yeshua. Some of them continued to consider John the Baptist their prophet, and they later became known as the Mandaeans, although they still consider themselves to be Nazarenes. So Nazarene doesn't necessarily mean Jesus follower. It pre-existed Jesus also, but I definitely resonate with that term. I consider myself a Nazarene or Nazarean or Nazarean. Um, I don't know. At some point, I might add it to the title of the church. We'll see, but that would be an awfully long title. So right now, instead of Jewish Christian, I prefer Essene Ebionite because I think that better represents what this ministry is all about. Okay, and Christian mysticism because I emphasize heavily mysticism, knowledge, experience of the divine, knowing God through our contemplative prayer practices, right? And so I wrote a book, Yeshua the Anointed One, Pre-Pauline Christianity. And in that book, I include Q, the Gospel of Thomas, the Epistle of James, and the Didache, and a little bit of the Hebrew Gospel, but not that much. The Recognitions and Homilies, definitely not, because they're both super long. And I give my commentary on the Gospel of Thomas, so that can give you a better idea also of what this ministry is really all about and what my focus is. All right. So I'm trying to provide an alternative for Christian mystics outside of the Catholic Church. I enjoy a lot of the writings and teachings of various Christian mystics throughout all the ages, going all the way back to the Desert Fathers and all that, the Abbas from Egypt, the original mystics, the original monks. But unfortunately, they all seem to buy into Pauline theology at some point, nearly all of them. So I don't resonate with that. And I definitely don't resonate with the Catholic Church, really on any level. So I won't go down that rabbit hole, but at any rate, I wanted to provide an alternative for Christian mystics outside of the Catholic Church or any other mainstream Christian organization that is based on Paul and not Yeshua, the Anointed One, the true prophet. All right. So I feel like right now, more than ever, probably, we really need the teachings and message of Yeshua. We live in a degenerate society, debased society, very sinful society and culture for the most part. And I think the world really needs the moral teachings and ethical teachings of Yeshua right now. Okay? So I want to read something from the homilies here with you all. If you don't know much about the history of the homilies and recognitions, I have a video called The History of the Clementine Recognitions and Homilies on my channel. You can check it out. So this comes from Book 1, verse 18. The will of God has been kept in obscurity in many ways. In the first place, there's evil instruction, wicked association, terrible society, unseemly discourses, wrongful prejudice. Thereby is error, then fearlessness, unbelief, fornication, covetousness, vainglory, and 10,000 other such evils, filling the world, as a quantity of smoke fills a house, have obscured the sight of the men inhabiting the world, and have not suffered them to look up and become acquainted with God the Creator from the delineation of himself which he has given, and to know what is pleasing to him. Wherefore it behooves the lovers of truth, crying out inwardly from their breasts to call for aid with truth-living reason, that someone living within the house, which is filled with smoke, may approach and open the door, so that the light of the sun, which is without, may be admitted into the house, and the smoke of the fire, which is within, may be driven out. Now the man who is the helper I call the true prophet, and he alone is able to enlighten the souls of men, so that with our own eyes we may be able to see the way of eternal salvation. But otherwise it is impossible, as you also know, since you said a little while ago that every doctrine is set up and pulled down, and the same is thought true or false according to the power of him who advocates it, so that doctrines do not appear as they are, but take the appearance of being or not being truth or falsehood from those who advocate them. On this account, the whole business of religion needed a true prophet, that he might tell us things that are, as they are, and how we must believe concerning all things, so that it is first necessary to test the prophet by every prophetic sign, and having ascertained that he is true, thereafter to believe him in everything, and not to sit in judgment upon his several sayings, but to receive them as certain, being accepted indeed by seeming faith, yet by sure judgment. For by our initial proof and by strict inquiry on every side, all things are received with right reason. Wherefore, before all things, it is necessary to seek after the true prophet, because without him it is impossible that any certainty can come to men. For even the Hebrews who believe Moses and do not observe the things spoken by him are not saved unless they observe the things that were spoken to them. For their believing Moses was not of their own will, but of God, who said to Moses, Behold, I come to thee in a pillar of cloud, that the people may hear me speaking to thee, and may believe thee forever. Since therefore, both to the Hebrews and to those who are called from the Gentiles, believing in the teachers of truth is of God. While excellent actions are left to everyone to do by his own judgment, the reward is righteously bestowed upon those who do well. Do, not believe, do. For there would have been no need of Moses or the coming of Jesus, if of themselves they would have understood what is reasonable. Neither is there salvation in believing in teachers and calling them lords. For on this account Jesus is concealed from the Jews who have taken Moses as their teacher, and Moses is hidden from those who have believed Jesus, for there being one teaching by both, God accepts him who has believed either of these, but believing a teacher is for the sake of doing the things spoken of by God. And that this is our Lord himself, and that this is so, our Lord himself says, I thank thee, Father of heaven and earth, because thou hast concealed these things from the wise and elder, and hast revealed them to suckling babes. Thus God himself has concealed a teacher from some, as foreknowing what they ought to do, and has revealed him to others who are ignorant what they ought to do. Neither, therefore, are the Hebrews condemned on account of their ignorance of Jesus by reason of him who has concealed him, if doing the things commanded by Moses. They do not hate him, whom they do not know. Neither are those from among the Gentiles condemned, who know not Moses on account of him who hath concealed him, provided that these also, doing the things spoken by Jesus, do not hate him, whom they do not know. And some will not be profited by calling the teachers lords, but not doing the works of servants, for on this account our Jesus himself said to one who often called him Lord, but did none of these things which he prescribed, Why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? For it is not in saying that will profit anyone, but doing. This is the opposite of Pauline theology, and it's what Yeshua taught. So Paul and Yeshua taught two opposite things. You cannot be a follower of Yeshua and Paul. You can't have two masters. You have to choose. By all means, therefore, is there need of good works. Moreover, if anyone has been thought worthy to recognize both as preaching one doctrine, that man has been counted rich in God, understanding both the old things as is new in time and the new things as old. So good works, do, doing, action, works, deeds, right? So essentially, what this passage says, what this passage is talking about, is the need for a true prophet. If we were all born enlightened and we knew exactly how to behave, how to act, how to treat people on this planet, and how to grow towards union with the divine, there would be no need for a true prophet, would there? I don't know anyone really, that is born knowing perfectly right from wrong, exactly how to act, exactly how to behave, exactly how to treat people, because we're all conditioned and programmed by the cultures that we grow up in. And so we become conditioned, brainwashed, programmed by the cultures that we belong to and the societies that we belong to. And they have their own ethics, they have their own morality. And it's not usually completely in line with what Yeshua taught or even what Moses taught. All right. And so, in other words, basically Peter says, look, you can be saved without knowledge of Yeshua or Moses or any other prophet if you inherently know exactly what to do, how to act, how to behave, how to grow closer to God. If that is inherent to your nature from birth, great, good for you. But if you're like the rest of us mere mortals, you need a true prophet. And that true prophet is Yeshua. He is the true messenger, the true prophet of God, the Messiah, the anointed one, the anointed of God. All right. In this ministry, and in all Jewish Christian literature, we do not believe Jesus is God. That's another big difference from what you find in the New Testament. Okay? But we do believe that Yeshua is the messenger of God. He is the true prophet. He is the Messiah. He is the anointed one. All right? And if you want to call him the Son of God, that's up to you. I don't use that terminology. He called himself the Son of Man for the most part. All right? But that's up to you. That's fine. But we do not believe that he is God. We do not believe in the Trinity. We are strict monotheists. And we also do not believe that Satan is another God in opposition to the one God. Okay, in the Clementine literature, for example, Satan is thought of as the force of ignorance in the universe that obscures the truth that God allows to exist. Of course, because he is omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient. So obviously he allows this dark force of ignorance to exist. All right? And he has his reasons for doing so. Okay? This duality in the manifest world has to exist because we are given free will and we have to choose the truth over the lies. We have to choose knowledge over ignorance. Okay? That is the spiritual path. And no one represents that truth better than Yeshua, the anointed one. He is the true prophet. And so, with all the chaos, all the uncertainty, all the ignorance, spiritual ignorance present in our world today, I believe that we are in need of this true prophet now more than ever. All right? We need to turn back to our Judeo-Christian roots, if we have Judeo-Christian roots. If not, then we can awaken to this reality here and now. All right? But we need to return to our Judeo-Christian roots from a different point of view, a different perspective, a different approach that completely rejects the teachings of Paul and completely embraces the teachings of Yeshua, especially those teachings that we find in Q and the Gospel of Thomas and the Hebrew Gospel, and also the interpretations of his teachings that we find in the Epistle of James, the Didache, and the Recognitions and Homilies. All right? So that is the main thrust or purpose of this ministry. So I hope that gives y'all a little bit better idea for why I decided to start this church in the first place. Right now, it is simply an online ministry. But in the future, I would love to have physical locations at some point. We have our little retreat center here in Chile in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. But this is not used for the purposes of this church. Okay, we don't have a community here or anything like that. It's just a retreat center where people come and go. And I kind of like it that way because I'm a bit of a hermit. Not a bit of a hermit, I'm definitely a hermit. And very introverted. So for now, that's working for me. But it's possible in the future that if people feel so compelled, that possibly we can have physical locations in the United States in the future. A couple of people have already talked to me about wanting to do that. Pretty gung ho. That's cool. That's great. Yeah, we'll see. But for now, this is an online ministry. So if y'all resonate with this ministry, feel free to reach out to me via email. And I'll put you on the email list and send you the links for the monthly Sabbath services. Thanks so much. Lots of love, many blessings.